"You may become a duchess," Lady Cecily whispered, tightening Lydia's wedding gown until the seams cut into her waist. "But no dress can conceal what you are." Outside the chamber, hundreds of noble guests waited to see why the Duke of Ashbourne had chosen a fat, supposedly ugly servant instead of Cecily's beautiful niece. Lydia knew the answer was not love. Julian needed a legal wife before midnight, or his late father's will would place the estate beneath Cecily's trusteeship. He had offered Lydia protection from a false charge of theft. In return, she would give him a marriage without affection or expectation. But when Lydia entered the chapel, she saw 3 estate ledgers stacked beside the marriage register. Ledgers Cecily claimed had been destroyed in a cellar flood. One still carried a flower mark Lydia herself had made while checking underweight deliveries. The records had never been destroyed. They had been hidden, and whoever placed them beside the altar wanted Lydia to sign away far more than her freedom. Lydia forced herself to look away before Cecily noticed where her attention had settled. "Too tight," Lydia said calmly. Cecily pulled the laces harder. "That is the purpose of a corset. The purpose of a corset is to support the gown, not prevent the bride from reaching the altar alive." For an instant, Cecily's elegant face hardened. She was the late Duke's younger sister, a woman who could make an insult sound like advice, and a threat resemble an invitation. Then her polished smile returned. "How amusing. Ashbourne has purchased himself a wife with a servant's wit. He has purchased nothing. Has he not? His Grace gives you his name, protection from prison, and a generous allowance. In exchange, you stand beside him until the estate is secure. Even in the kitchens, that would be called a transaction." Lydia met Cecily's reflection in the mirror. The ivory silk could not disguise the redness around her wrists where a constable had bound them 2 nights earlier. A silver cream jug had been discovered beneath her mattress, though Lydia had never entered the locked pantry from which it had disappeared. Julian had stopped the arrest. He had not declared her innocent. Instead, he had offered marriage. The arrangement had seemed absurd, until he showed her his father's will. If Julian remained unmarried when he turned 30, management of Ashbourne would pass for 5 years to a board of trustees chaired by Cecily. By dawn, she intended to dismiss the tenants already behind on their rents and sell the eastern farms to Lord Haversham. Lydia had grown up among such families. She knew eviction was not an inconvenience recorded in a solicitor's book. It was a mother boiling nettles for supper. It was a child sleeping beneath a cart. It was a grave left untended because the living had been driven elsewhere. She had therefore named her price. No tenant could be expelled for 12 months without the Duke's personal review. Julian had agreed. That agreement did not make him kind. It merely made him preferable to Cecily. The chapel bells began their first warning peal. Cecily released the laces. There, almost respectable. Lydia turned from the mirror and lifted the train herself. Respectability must be a fragile thing if it depends upon how little space a woman occupies. She crossed the corridor before Cecily could answer. When the chapel doors opened, conversation ceased with such suddenness that Lydia heard the candles sputtering. Every face turned toward her. Some displayed fascination, others disbelief, and many open contempt. At the altar stood Julian Harcourt, Duke of Ashbourne. He wore black formal coat and silver waistcoat, his posture rigid enough to suggest he faced an execution rather than a wedding. At 30, he possessed the severe beauty portrait painters adored. Dark hair, a straight nose, and eyes the gray of winter steel, yet fatigue had carved shadows beneath them. Since his father's death, he had slept little and trusted almost no one. His gaze found Lydia's bound wrists before rising to her face. Something like anger flickered there, but he said nothing. She walked alone down the aisle. Halfway to the altar, a woman whispered, deliberately loudly, "Cecily's niece must be relieved. Better no duchess's coronet than one purchased at the cost of a man's sanity." Several guests laughed. Julian turned toward them. "Anyone unable to witness my marriage without insulting my bride may leave Ashbourne immediately." The laughter died. It was a defense, but not an apology. Lydia remembered how he had questioned her after the silver was found, each word cold with suspicion. Even now, he protected the dignity of his title as much as hers. She reached the altar and placed her hand in his. "You are trembling," he murmured. "The gown is attempting to murder me." His eyes briefly shifted toward Cecily. "We shall have it loosened after the ceremony." "We." The small word unsettled her more than the hundreds of staring faces. The clergyman began, but Lydia's attention returned to the ledgers beside the register. The top volume bore a blurred mark near its spine, a crescent of flour mixed with blue dye. She had made that stain 6 months earlier, while comparing the kitchen deliveries against the steward's invoices. She remembered the exact page beneath it. 14 sacks of wheat had been recorded. Only 11 had arrived. When Lydia questioned the discrepancy, the steward claimed the missing sacks had spoiled in transit. 3 weeks later, another delivery had been short, then another. She began keeping her own figures, using the methods her father had taught her when he managed accounts for a coaching inn. Cecily later announced that the estate records had been destroyed when a pipe burst in the cellar. Yet here they were, dry and intact, waiting beside Lydia's marriage contract. The clergyman finished the vows. Julian slid the Harcourt ring onto her finger. Lydia took the pen. Across the chapel, Cecily watched her with unnatural stillness. She was not furious that an unwanted servant was becoming Duchess of Ashbourne. She looked almost satisfied. Lydia lowered the nib but did not sign. The marriage contract rested upon the same 3 ledgers that could prove someone had been stealing from the estate. Once Lydia added her name, those books would pass into the custody of Cecily's solicitor as supporting records for the trusteeship dispute. The missing silver had never been intended merely to send Lydia to prison. It had forced Julian to marry the one woman capable of recognizing the ledgers, and place that woman's signature directly above the evidence of Ashbourne's ruin. Someone had not tried to prevent this wedding. Someone had engineered it. The nib hovered above the contract long enough for the clergyman to clear his throat. Julian's fingers tightened around hers. "Lydia?" She bent closer to the document, pretending to examine the place marked for her signature, while her eyes followed the language beneath it. The first clauses matched the agreement Julian had shown her the previous evening: an annual allowance, private apartments, and protection for Ashbourne's tenants. The final paragraph did not. Upon the Duke's incapacity, absence, or death, all records bearing the Duchess's signature could be surrendered to the estate's temporary trustees for examination and settlement. Lydia looked at the 3 ledgers beneath the contract. By signing while they rested together, she would not legally authenticate their contents. Yet to a crowded chapel already inclined to believe her a thief, the arrangement would create a powerful image: the former maid, the missing silver, the questionable accounts, and her signature placed directly over the books documenting Ashbourne's losses. The truth might eventually prevail in court. Cecily would need only enough suspicion to remove Lydia and declare Julian incapable of governing his estate. "Were these ledgers here when you approved the contract?" Lydia asked softly. Julian glanced downward. "No, do not look at your aunt." His expression sharpened, but he obeyed. "Sign," Cecily called from behind them. "Unless the new Duchess has suddenly remembered another condition." Lydia dipped the pen into the ink. Instead of signing immediately, she pulled the contract away from the ledgers and laid it flat upon the bare oak table. Cecily's smile vanished. Lydia wrote her name in slow, deliberate strokes. Julian signed beside it. The clergyman added his own name and announced them husband and wife as the chapel clock began striking midnight. At the first chime, Cecily lost control of Ashbourne. By the 12th, Lydia Bell had become its duchess. No applause followed. Julian offered his arm, and Lydia accepted because 200 people were waiting for her to stumble. As they turned toward the aisle, she saw the steward, Mr. Nathaniel Pike, quietly lifting the 3 ledgers from the table. "Those remain here," Lydia said. Pike froze. The Duke looked between them. "Why?" "They are estate property." Pike recovered quickly. He was a thin man with carefully arranged gray hair and a voice made smooth by years of delivering unpleasant news on behalf of powerful people. "Her Grace is mistaken. Lady Cecily asked me to return them to the records room." "The records room that was flooded?" Lydia asked. A murmur moved through the nearest pews. Cecily stepped forward. "This is hardly the moment to discuss household accounts." "Then they can wait until morning." Lydia placed one hand upon the top ledger. Here. Julian studied her face. She gave the slightest shake of her head, hoping he understood that an explanation before this audience would be dangerous. "Leave them," he ordered. Pike's hand withdrew, but his eyes rested on Lydia with a coldness she had never seen during her years below stairs. She had made an enemy before leaving the chapel. The wedding breakfast was held in the long gallery beneath portraits of Harcourt ancestors who appeared equally offended by their newest relative. Lydia was seated beside Julian at the head of the table, though the chair was narrow and its carved arms pressed painfully against her hips. Cecily's niece, Miss Arabella Vale, occupied the place opposite. Arabella was everything society believed a duchess should be: slender, golden-haired, delicately spoken, and trained since childhood to disguise contempt beneath perfect manners. "I hope you will not find the transition too difficult," she told Lydia. "The customs of a ducal household can be overwhelming to someone accustomed to polishing its silver." "I expect so," Lydia replied. "Fortunately, I already know where the silver is meant to be kept." Julian's mouth tightened, suppressing what might have been a smile. Cecily heard only the reference to the theft. "An unfortunate subject for levity, considering the evidence found in your room." "Evidence placed in my room," Lydia corrected. "Surely you do not accuse the servants who once worked beside you." "No, I accuse no one until I possess facts." The words quieted the immediate conversation. Lydia felt Julian looking at her, but she concentrated on the meal. The soup had gone cold. The bread rolls were smaller than those served the previous week, and only half the usual quantity of butter had been placed on the table, despite the presence of 3 times as many guests. Those details seemed trivial to people who had never counted meals to determine whether a household would survive winter. To Lydia, they formed a language. Someone was cutting supplies even while the invoices claimed they had increased. A young footman approached with wine. His name was Thomas Reed, a tenant farmer's son, who had entered service after an accident left his father unable to work. As he leaned toward Lydia's glass, his hand shook so badly that wine spilled across the cloth. Cecily recoiled. "Clumsy fool. I beg your pardon, my lady. You will receive no wages for this week." Thomas went white. His wages bought medicine for his father. "The cloth belongs to me now," Lydia said. "Therefore, the loss is mine. His wages will remain untouched." Cecily's eyes narrowed. "You have been a duchess for less than an hour. Long enough to recognize spilled wine." Julian set down his spoon. "Thomas will not be punished." The footman bowed and retreated. As he collected Lydia's empty plate, he slipped a small folded paper beneath the edge of her napkin. She waited until Cecily turned to answer another guest, before opening it beneath the table. "Your Grace, I saw Mr. Pike enter your old room before the silver was found. Meet me in the north still room after evening prayers. Tell no one." Lydia folded the note into her sleeve. Thomas had valued her before she possessed a title. That made his warning more trustworthy, but also placed him in danger. If Pike had entered her room, then the theft charge and the hidden ledgers belonged to the same design. After the breakfast, Julian escorted Lydia to the Duchess's apartments. The rooms had been prepared with suspicious speed. New gowns filled the wardrobe. Her preferred lavender soap rested beside the basin, and a pair of satin slippers had been made in precisely her size. Lydia touched one slipper, feeling the blood drain from her face. These were not prepared overnight. Julian frowned. "Cecily said they belonged to my mother. Your mother had feet 3 sizes smaller than mine." She turned the slipper over. Stitched inside the lining were the initials LB. Julian stared at them. Lydia finally understood the true mismatch. Officially, their marriage had been a desperate decision made 2 nights ago after her arrest. Yet someone had measured her body, learned her preferences, and prepared these rooms weeks before the silver disappeared. Their marriage had not merely been anticipated. It had been planned. Julian continued staring at the embroidered initials, as though they might rearrange themselves into a harmless explanation. "Who could have obtained your measurements?" "The housekeeper keeps measurements for every servant's uniform. Mrs. Finch would never participate in this." "I did not say she had. Her fitting book is kept in the linen office, and half the senior household can request access to it." Lydia examined the slippers without putting them on. Their silver embroidery matched the gown Cecily had selected, but the inner stitches were uneven, as though the initials had been added in haste. She then opened the wardrobe. 6 gowns hung inside, each cut for her figure. Day dresses, an evening gown, a riding habit, and a black morning dress had all been completed long before Julian proposed. At the bottom of the wardrobe stood a cedar chest containing gloves, stockings, and undergarments made to her precise size. Julian crossed the room and pulled the bell cord. Lydia caught his wrist before it sounded. If you summon the staff and demand answers, the person responsible will know we are suspicious. His gaze dropped to her hand. She released him immediately. You ask me to remain silent in my own house. I ask you to consider why these things were meant to be discovered. His jaw tightened. They were hidden inside your private apartments. Nothing here is hidden. The gowns faced the door. The slippers were placed beside the bed with their initials visible. Whoever prepared this room wanted us to find them and begin accusing people. Julian looked around again, this time with greater care. His anger did not vanish, but it became controlled. What do you propose? We behave as though we believe your aunt's explanation. Then we learn who paid for the clothes. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Agnes Finch entered, carrying a tray of tea. The housekeeper was a square-shouldered woman in her late 50s who had served the Harcourt family since Julian's childhood. She greeted Lydia with the formal curtsy due a duchess, though her eyes shone with restrained emotion. Your Grace, she said. Lydia had once scrubbed floors under Mrs. Finch's supervision. Hearing the title from her felt stranger than hearing it in the chapel. The rooms are beautifully prepared, Lydia said. Lady Cecily must have given you very detailed instructions. Mrs. Finch placed the tray down. I received no instructions, Your Grace. Her ladyship told me yesterday that everything had been brought from London. And the wardrobe? It arrived 6 weeks ago in locked trunks. Mr. Pike said they contained furnishings intended for the East guest rooms. He alone held the keys. Julian went still. 6 weeks? Yes, Your Grace. Did Pike order the slippers as well? Lydia asked. I cannot say. The trunks were opened this morning while we were all in the chapel. When I returned, the garments had already been arranged. Lydia thanked her and asked that no one be told of their questions. Mrs. Finch hesitated only long enough to understand the danger, then promised her silence. After she left, Julian poured the tea himself. He handed Lydia a cup without asking whether duchesses were supposed to serve or be served. 6 weeks ago, he said, I had never spoken to you. You had spoken at me twice. When? Once when you found me standing on a ladder in the pantry and ordered me to stop stealing preserves. I remember that. You told me I was welcome to count the jars. You declined. The second time? You asked why I had placed stones beside the flour sacks. Julian's eyes narrowed in recognition. You said each stone represented a missing pound. Lydia nodded. Her father had taught her to verify deliveries before she could properly write. At the coaching inn where he kept accounts, merchants sometimes altered weights or padded invoices, trusting that busy cooks would never measure every sack. After his death, the habit remained with her. She carried the tea tray to a small table and examined the sugar bowl. Ashbourne had always bought coarse brown sugar from a Bristol merchant, but these crystals were pale and fine. Where are the household invoices kept now? She asked. In the estate office. Then take me there. Within half an hour, Julian had dismissed Mr. Pike from the office under the pretense of needing privacy with his bride. The steward's expression remained respectful, though his gaze settled briefly upon the ink stain on Lydia's right forefinger, the mark of someone accustomed to figures rather than dusting shelves. Lydia waited until he left before opening the current supply ledger. The accounts appeared orderly. Every page carried Pike's signature, delivery dates, quantities, and payments authorized with Julian's seal. Yet the more orderly they appeared, the less she trusted them. She selected 3 recent entries: flour, sugar, and lamp oil. Then she asked Julian to send for the unopened stock remaining in the storerooms. By late afternoon, sacks, jars, and oil cans covered the office floor. Lydia weighed each item on the brass merchant's scale, while Julian recorded the results. 30 sacks of flour listed in the ledger became 24. 200 pounds of sugar became 160. 12 cans of lamp oil became 9. The servants may already have used some, Julian said. The deliveries arrived yesterday. The kitchen consumption book records only 2 sacks of flour and 18 pounds of sugar. The lamps have not been filled since Monday. She checked the totals again. The shortages followed the same proportion. Almost exactly 1/5 missing from every order. Julian stared at the figures. How much has been lost? If the same pattern extends across the estate, thousands of pounds each year. He turned toward the door, but Lydia stopped him before he could summon Pike. Not yet. These shortages prove goods are missing, not who took them. She lifted the newest flour sack. Its cord had been tied with a distinctive double loop around a small metal clasp. Most suppliers used ordinary hemp knots, but this clasp bore a tiny stamped image of a swallow. Lydia had seen the mark before. 6 months earlier, when she first noticed the missing grain, she had removed an identical clasp and hidden it inside her father's old account box. She had believed it belonged to the merchant. Now the unopened sack proved otherwise. The clasp was attached after delivery, inside Ashbourne's own storeroom. She slipped it into an envelope. Julian melted plain red wax over the flap, pressed his signet into it, and wrote the time across the seal, so no one could replace the contents without breaking it. "Where will you keep it?" he asked. "Not in these rooms. Pike has keys." Julian placed the envelope inside the inner pocket of his coat. "Then he must take it from me." For the first time, Lydia saw him choose to trust her judgment over the authority of the man who had managed his estate for years. A movement sounded beyond the half-closed door. Julian pulled it open. The corridor was empty, but a wet footprint marked the polished floor. It pointed toward the servants' staircase, and caught in its heel was a single pale thread of silver, the same thread used to embroider Lydia's initials inside the slippers. Someone had listened to every calculation. Moments later, the chapel bell rang for evening prayers. Thomas was waiting for Lydia in the north stillroom. If the listener reached him first, the young footman might never live long enough to reveal what he had seen. The final stroke of the chapel bell was still echoing when Lydia gathered her skirts and hurried toward the servants' staircase. Julian followed close behind her. "You cannot come with me," she said. "You have just suggested that a witness may be in danger. And if the Duke of Ashbourne is seen entering a stillroom with a footman, everyone will know Thomas spoke to us." Julian stopped at the landing. "Then I shall wait outside the passage. Anyone watching me will also see you." His expression hardened. "I will not stand in my bedchamber while you walk into danger alone." Lydia studied the corridor and pointed toward the old portrait gallery. "There is a narrow service door behind your grandfather's portrait. It opens beside the stillroom pantry." "How do you know?" "I spent 4 years carrying coal through it while your family used the main corridors." The answer silenced him. Lydia took the lower stairs while Julian turned toward the gallery. The north stillroom lay in the oldest part of the house, where herbs, medicines, preserves, and scented waters were prepared. Its windows faced the kitchen garden, and only one oil lamp burned inside. "Thomas?" Lydia whispered. No one answered. She stepped past shelves of dried lavender and glass bottles. A chair had been overturned near the work table. Beside it lay a broken jar of rosemary water, its sharp fragrance spreading through the room. Then she heard breathing behind the locked pantry door. Lydia lifted the latch. Thomas stumbled out, one hand pressed over his bleeding mouth. A bruise was already forming along his jaw. "Who did this?" "I did not see his face." Thomas struggled to steady himself. "Someone seized me from behind and demanded the note. When I said I had already given it to you, he struck me and locked me inside." The hidden service door opened, and Julian entered. Thomas recoiled. "Your Grace, I meant no disrespect. You have shown more loyalty than many men who dine at my table." Julian closed the door. "Tell us what you saw." Thomas looked toward Lydia before speaking. 2 nights ago, Mr. Pike entered the servants' wing after midnight. He carried the housekeeper's spare keys. I was returning from taking medicine to my father when I saw him leave your room. Later, Lady Cecily's maid, Miss Morrow, came down the same corridor, carrying something wrapped in a cloth. "The silver jug," Lydia said. "I think so. It reflected light through a tear in the fabric." "Why did you not speak when the constable arrested her?" Julian asked. Thomas lowered his head. "Mr. Pike holds the lease to my father's cottage. He said if I contradicted him, we would be removed before the end of the week." The explanation struck Lydia with greater force than the insult in the chapel. Thomas had not lacked courage. He had been forced to choose between truth and his injured father's shelter. Julian's face showed no sympathy. "You allowed an innocent woman to be taken in chains." "Yes, Your Grace." "Julian," Lydia said quietly, "he is speaking now, after being beaten for it." The Duke looked at Thomas's bruised face. His anger remained, but its direction shifted. "You and your father will be moved to the gatekeeper's cottage tonight," he said. "Its tenancy is held directly under my seal. Pike cannot remove you." Relief crossed Thomas's face, followed immediately by fear. "If they know you are protecting me, they will understand why." "Then they must not know," Lydia said. She took a cloth from the table, soaked it with clean water, and handed it to him. "You slipped on the wet garden steps while fetching rosemary for my headache. I found you here and ordered you relieved of duty." Thomas pressed the cloth to his mouth. "But no one saw me fetching rosemary." "They will in 5 minutes." She picked up an empty herb basket, placed several rosemary branches inside it, and scattered damp leaves along the garden entrance. Then she smeared a little mud onto Thomas's shoes and coat. The staged accident would not withstand formal questioning, but it might delay suspicion until he and his father were moved. Voices sounded in the passage. Lydia stepped in front of Thomas, just as Cecily, Pike, and Miss Morrow entered. Cecily surveyed the broken jar, the overturned chair, and Thomas's bloodied lip. "What has happened?" "The boy fell," Lydia replied. Pike looked at the dry floor between Thomas and the pantry. "Inside the still room?" "On the garden steps. He came inside afterward." "How fortunate that Your Grace found him." "Very." Miss Morrow's gaze moved toward Lydia's sleeve, where Thomas's folded note remained concealed. Lydia lowered her arm naturally. Cecily turned to Julian. "I have been searching for you. Mr. Pike has discovered serious irregularities in the household deliveries." Lydia felt Julian's attention sharpen. Pike produced several pages of figures. "After Her Grace mentioned the unusually small wedding breakfast, I examined the storerooms. It appears one of our merchants has supplied less than the quantities invoiced. He had taken Lydia's discovery and rebuilt it as his own within an hour." "How much is missing?" Julian asked. "Approximately 1/10 from certain orders." 1/10? Lydia repeated. Pike smiled. "A preliminary estimate." Julian folded his arms. "And how did you calculate it?" The steward explained that he had compared current stores against average household consumption. His language was polished, but he mentioned no weights, no kitchen consumption book, and no reason the shortages occurred in the same proportion across unrelated goods. Lydia remained silent. Julian did not. Her Grace weighed the deliveries. "The shortage is closer to 1/5. Pike's smile weakened. "She also established," Julian continued, "that the missing goods vanished after reaching Ashbourne, not during transport." Cecily looked at Lydia as though seeing her for the first time. A duchess crawling among flour sacks on her wedding day. How admirable. "The tenants will not admire it when winter supplies disappear," Lydia said. "The tenants are not your concern. They became my concern when I signed the marriage contract." Cecily's fan snapped shut. "You would do well to remember that becoming a duchess does not make you competent to manage an estate." "No," Lydia replied. "Learning to count did that." Julian turned away, but not before Lydia saw unmistakable amusement in his eyes. For one dangerous instant, she felt warmed by it. Then Cecily's gaze shifted to Thomas. "The boy should be dismissed for his clumsiness." "He acted under my orders," Lydia said. "If punishment is required, direct it toward me." "As you wish," Cecily answered softly. The absence of argument alarmed Lydia more than anger would have. That evening, Thomas and his father were moved to the gatekeeper's cottage. Lydia surrendered the right to hire her own lady's maid in exchange for Mrs. Finch personally supervising the transfer, ensuring no one intercepted them. It was a small privilege to lose, but it left Lydia dependent upon Cecily's household staff and without a private attendant she could trust. Near midnight, Miss Morrow entered Cecily's dressing room and placed Thomas's undelivered dismissal notice upon the table. "He has been moved beyond Mr. Pike's reach," she said. Cecily stood beside the fire, watching the flames consume one of the estate invoices. "Then the footman is no longer our easiest weakness. What shall we do about the new Duchess?" Cecily dropped the burning page into the grate. "We gave Lydia Bell a title because we needed her signature," she said. "Now we shall use that signature to prove she has been stealing from Ashbourne all along." At 9 the following morning, a magistrate arrived at Ashbourne with 2 constables and a document bearing Lydia's signature. She found them waiting in the Duke's study with Cecily, Pike, and Julian. The 3 ledgers from the chapel lay upon the desk. Beside them rested a sheet of paper covered with columns of figures. Sir Matthew Colborne, the county magistrate, did not invite Lydia to sit. "Your Grace, do you recognize this handwriting?" She approached the desk. The figures recorded quantities of grain, sugar, lamp oil, and other provisions removed from Ashbourne over the previous 8 months. Every missing shipment corresponded almost perfectly with the shortages Lydia had calculated. At the bottom appeared her name, Lydia Bell. The signature resembled hers closely enough to convince anyone who had watched her sign the marriage contract. "It is an imitation." Sir Matthew placed the wedding register beside it. "The formation of the letters is identical. A skilled forger copies what is distinctive, or a guilty woman denies what has been discovered." Julian stood near the window, holding himself unnaturally still. "Where was this document found?" Pike answered. "Behind a loose panel in her Grace's former room. The same room you entered before the silver appeared beneath my mattress," Lydia said. The steward's face remained composed. "That is a serious allegation. Thomas Reed saw you." Cecily exchanged a glance with Pike. It lasted less than a second, but Lydia saw it. Sir Matthew did not. "The footman who injured himself yesterday?" "The footman who was struck and locked inside the north still room. Do you possess proof of that?" "The broken jar, the overturned chair, and the bruise on his face. Your own account states that he fell on the garden steps." The lie Lydia had created to protect Thomas now weakened his testimony. Pike had anticipated that she would either leave the boy exposed or conceal what happened. Either decision served him. Cecily opened one of the ledgers. There is more. Several kitchen receipts had been sewn between its pages. Each recorded a complete delivery, but the sums written in the margins showed the value of the missing portion. Beside the calculations appeared small crescent marks in blue pencil. Lydia recognized them immediately. Her father had taught her to use a blue crescent when a figure required later verification. She had used the symbol in the private notes kept inside his old account box. "Where is my box?" she asked. Cecily raised her eyebrows. "What box?" "A walnut account box from my former room. Mrs. Finch had arranged for Lydia's few possessions to be moved after the wedding. The box should have been in her new apartments." "It was not." Sir Matthew tapped the false statement. "The writer used the same mark beside every stolen quantity. Do you deny that the symbol is yours?" "No, I deny placing it here." Pike opened another ledger. The shortages began shortly after Miss Bell was assigned to the Ashbourne kitchens. Her position gave her access to the deliveries. Her father's history as an innkeeper's accountant gave her the skill to conceal the transactions. "My skill allowed me to discover them." "So you claim after being caught?" Lydia looked toward Julian. "The swallow clasp is still in your pocket." He removed the sealed envelope and handed it to Sir Matthew. The wax remained unbroken. Inside lay the metal clasp Lydia had taken from the flour sack. Sir Matthew examined its stamped bird. "What does this prove?" "That the sacks were opened and retied after reaching the estate," Lydia explained. "I found an identical clasp 6 months ago and placed it in my father's box." "The box that is now missing," Cecily said. Julian's gaze settled upon Lydia. The doubt in his eyes was slight, but it was there. "You never told me you had kept another clasp," he said. "There was no reason until we found this one. You also did not tell me about the private notes using that symbol. You did not ask how I recorded the shortages." Cecily gave a sorrowful sigh. "Julian, she fed you fragments of the truth, because she knew each discovery would make her appear useful. She led you to the storeroom, produced a meaningless clasp, and then accused the steward who could expose her. That is not what happened, Lydia said. Is it not? She married you while under arrest. Within hours, she placed herself inside the estate office. Now she asks you to distrust every servant who questions her. Julian's face closed behind the cold reserve Lydia had first seen during her arrest. I need time to examine the evidence, he said. Sir Matthew nodded. Until then, Her Grace must remain under supervision. Lydia stared at her husband. You agreed to protect me from a false accusation. I agreed to prevent you from being imprisoned before the facts were known. And now? You will remain in your apartments. No constable will touch you, but you may not enter the servants' wing, storerooms, or estate office. The decision fell between them like a locked door. By restricting her access, Julian gave Pike time to alter the accounts and remove whatever remained in the storerooms. Worse, the 3 original ledgers were surrendered to Sir Matthew, who ordered them packed for transport to the county courthouse. Lydia watched Pike wrap each volume in brown cloth. The flour-stained ledger disappeared first. Julian had not condemned her, but his incomplete trust had placed the strongest evidence beyond her reach. 2 constables escorted Lydia upstairs. Cecily followed, wearing the expression of a concerned relative. At the door to Lydia's apartments, a maid waited with a breakfast tray. The girl was new and young enough that fear showed plainly on her face. As she passed Lydia, the maid whispered without moving her lips, "The east barns are being emptied." Lydia stopped. Cecily nearly walked into her. "Is something wrong?" "My shoe," Lydia said, bending as though to adjust it. Through the window at the end of the corridor, she could see the lower road. A line of empty grain wagons was moving toward the eastern fields. Each wagon bore a painted swallow on its rear board. The shortages had never been random thefts for private profit. Someone had been accumulating Ashbourne's grain in a hidden location, using the estate's own delivery system. According to the tenancy agreement, the eastern farmers' annual rents were due in grain at noon the next day. If the barns were found empty during the official collection, the tenants would be declared in default. Cecily's trustees could seize their farms under the very clause Lydia had forced Julian to suspend, because criminal accusations against the new Duchess could invalidate the marriage agreement containing that protection. The forged evidence was not merely designed to remove Lydia. It was meant to clear the estate office before the greatest theft occurred. And the wagons were already moving. Lydia straightened slowly, keeping her body between Cecily and the window. "I require a private conversation with my husband." Cecily glanced at the constables. "His Grace is occupied with the magistrate." "Then tell him the eastern tenants are about to lose more than their grain." For the first time, Cecily's composure fractured. It lasted only an instant, but Lydia saw the slight widening of her eyes. "I have no idea what you mean." "Then you have no reason to prevent me from speaking to him." Cecily ordered the maid to take Lydia inside and instructed one constable to remain at the door. She then walked away with measured dignity, though her pace quickened as soon as she reached the staircase. Lydia entered the apartments and turned to the frightened maid. "What is your name?" "Ellen Shaw, Your Grace." "How do you know the east barns are being emptied?" "My brothers work at Larkfield Farm. Mr. Pike's men arrived before dawn and said the grain rents were being collected early. When my eldest brother objected, they struck him." "Where are the loaded wagons being taken?" "No one knows. But the men were ordered to remove every sack before noon." Lydia crossed to the writing desk, then stopped. Any message carried through the door would be inspected. She looked at the untouched breakfast tray and lifted the silver cover. Beneath it lay warm bread, eggs, and a small pot of honey. "Did you bring this from the kitchen?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Then you must return the tray." Lydia took a knife and cut the bread lengthwise. On the inside surface, she scratched 4 words. "Swallow wagons. Eastern rent, noon." She closed the loaf so the message disappeared, replaced it upon the tray, and handed the tray to Ellen. "Take this to the Duke. Say I refuse to eat. Do not mention the bread." Ellen's face paled. "The constable will search it." "Let him. He will see only breakfast." The girl carried the tray out. Lydia waited beside the window, counting every wagon that passed along the lower road. 9, 10. 11. The first loaded wagon appeared 20 minutes later. Its canvas covering sagged over a full cargo. Instead of turning west toward Ashbourne's central granary, it continued north, toward the abandoned Harcourt malt house. Lydia knew the place from old cartage accounts. It stood beside the river, 2 miles beyond the estate boundary, legally owned by a company called North Vale Storage. 3 years earlier, Pike had claimed the building was unusable because its lower floor flooded every spring. Vale. The name had always appeared ordinary in the accounts. Now, it sounded like an admission. The apartment door opened abruptly. Julian entered carrying the loaf in one hand. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "Sir Matthew believes I am attempting to interfere with his investigation. The Swallow wagons are collecting the tenants' grain 1 day before the rent is due. They are taking it north, probably to the old malt house. How can you know their destination?" The cartage invoices. North Vale Storage has charged Ashbourne for short journeys every month, always calculated as 4 miles there and back. The malt house is exactly 2 miles from the eastern farms. North Vale could refer to the district. It refers to Cecily. The company began receiving payments 6 months after your father made her head of the provisional trust. Julian walked to the window and saw the wagons. Why collect the grain early? Because by noon tomorrow, the barns will be empty and the tenants unable to pay what they have already surrendered. Pike will record them as defaulters. Your aunt will claim that my marriage agreement protecting them was obtained through fraud. The marriage remains legal, even if you are convicted of theft. The marriage, yes. The additional conditions may not. Sir Matthew could suspend them while the accusation is examined. Julian swore beneath his breath and reached for the door. A distant explosion shook the window panes. Black smoke rose beyond the eastern trees. Ellen screamed from the corridor. One of the constables ran to the window. "The Larkfield barn," Lydia said. A second bell began ringing from the tenant village, not the measured call to worship, but the frantic alarm for fire. Julian opened the door. "Release my wife." Sir Matthew appeared at the far end of the corridor, with Cecily and Pike behind him. "She remains confined by my order. My tenants' grain is being removed, and their barns are burning." Pike stepped forward. "The tenants have become violent. My men attempted to collect lawful rent, and someone set fire to the barn." "The rent is not due until tomorrow," Lydia said. "That is incorrect. It is written in every Eastern lease." Pike drew a folded document from his coat. "The collection date was amended last month with His Grace's authorization." Julian seized the paper. His ducal seal appeared beneath the amendment. "I never approved this." Sir Matthew examined it. "The seal appears genuine." "Then someone has used it without permission." Cecily's voice remained smooth. "Or you signed more papers than you remember while grieving your father." Another servant came running up the stairs. Blood streaked one side of his face. "Your Grace, Pike's bailiffs have barricaded themselves inside the Larkfield yard. The tenants are trying to break through the gate. Mrs. Reed and 2 children are trapped in the burning granary. Thomas's mother and younger siblings." Julian turned to Sir Matthew. "You may either release the Duchess or arrest me with her." "You would defy a magistrate's order?" "I would prevent murder on my own land." He took Lydia's hand and led her toward the stairs. Sir Matthew ordered the constables to stop them, but neither man moved. Julian was still their duke, and the smoke visible through the windows made obedience less simple than law. Within minutes, horses were harnessed to the open carriage. Julian took the reins himself, while Lydia climbed beside him. Sir Matthew followed on horseback with both constables. Cecily remained at Ashbourne, but Pike mounted a grey gelding and rode ahead by another road. "He is going to destroy something," Lydia said. "Or warn his men." "Both." They reached Larkfield to find the yard engulfed in chaos. Flames climbed the granary roof. Tenants hammered against the locked gate, while armed bailiffs guarded a line of loaded wagons. A woman screamed from an upper window, where smoke poured through the broken glass. Julian leaped from the carriage and ordered the bailiffs to open the gate. Their leader shook his head. "We answer to the trustees. You answer to the owner of Ashbourne. Lady Cecily provided documents transferring temporary authority after your marriage to an accused thief." The trap had been prepared before Lydia ever entered the chapel. Julian drew a pistol from beneath the carriage seat and fired once into the air. "Open it!" The bailiffs hesitated. That moment was enough for the tenants to smash the gate inward. Lydia ran toward the burning building, but the main doors were blocked by a fallen roof beam. Through the smoke, she noticed pale dust pouring from a ventilation hatch near the ground. Not smoke, flour. "This is not the grain barn," she shouted. "It is the milling store. There is a delivery passage beneath the rear wall." As a kitchen maid, she had once received flour sent from Larkfield and remembered the farmers complaining that sacks had to be pushed through a low tunnel because the main door was too narrow for carts. Julian gathered 6 men and followed her around the building. Brambles concealed the old delivery hatch. They tore them aside, broke the rusted lock, and crawled into the smoke. One by one, the trapped family members were pulled through the passage. Lydia emerged last with Thomas's youngest sister clinging to her neck. Her gown was blackened, her palms blistered, and half her hair had fallen loose. The roof collapsed seconds later. Across the yard, Pike's men abandoned 3 wagons and fled north with the rest. Sir Matthew stared at the rescued children, then at the false collection order in his hand. "I will summon county officers. They will arrive after midnight," Lydia said. "By then, the grain will be moved from the malt house to the river barges." Julian looked toward the northern road. Supporting her now would mean openly accusing his aunt, rejecting his steward, and admitting before the county magistrate that his seal had been compromised under his own roof. He handed Lydia the reins of the nearest wagon. "Tell me what you need." "The empty wagons, 6 tenant farmers, Thomas, and every original lease that has not passed through Pike's office." "For what purpose?" "To let our enemies believe the fire destroyed their final obstacle." Lydia looked at the swallow painted on the wagon. "Tonight, we follow their own transport line into the malt house and count every sack before it can reach the river." Sir Matthew objected. "Her Grace remains under investigation." Julian stepped between the magistrate and Lydia. "Then investigate her while she saves the estate you nearly handed to its thieves." As darkness fell, Lydia changed into a tenant woman's coat and hid beneath the canvas of an empty swallow wagon. Thomas took the driver's seat, while Julian and the farmers concealed themselves among the trees along the northern road. Ahead of them, the malt house windows glowed beside the river. The last barge would depart at dawn, and Pike was already waiting inside. Thomas drove the empty wagon through the malt house gates without slowing. He wore a bailiff's discarded coat and kept his hat pulled low over his bruised face. A guard raised a lantern. "Why are you empty?" "Fire at Larkfield," Thomas answered. "The tenants broke the gate. Pike ordered us back for another load." The guard cursed and waved him through. Beneath the canvas, Lydia lay pressed against the wagon boards, listening to the rumble of river water beyond the building. Julian had wanted to enter with her, but one unfamiliar face risked exposure. 2 guaranteed it. He and the farmers waited in the woods, ready to block the road when she gave the signal. The wagon stopped inside a stone warehouse. Through a tear in the canvas, Lydia saw hundreds of grain sacks stacked from floor to rafters. Every sack carried an Ashbourne farm mark that had been covered with black paint. Men rolled them toward a loading platform where a barge waited upon the river. Pike stood beside a counting table. "Only 11 wagons?" he demanded. "The rest scattered after the fire," Thomas replied. "Then return before the Duke regains control of the road." Thomas climbed down and pretended to inspect the rear wheel. Lydia slipped from beneath the opposite side of the wagon and crawled behind a stack of barley sacks. The air smelled of damp stone, grain dust, and lamp oil. She moved toward the counting table while Pike argued with the barge captain. A large ledger lay open beside a cash box. Each page recorded grain received from Ashbourne and payments made by North Vale Storage. Lydia recognized the blue crescent beside several quantities. Whoever had copied her father's notation into the false evidence had practiced it here first. She needed more than a glimpse. She needed the ledger itself, or a record that could survive Pike's denial. From inside her coat, Lydia removed a stub of pencil and several folded sheets. She copied the latest entries, including wagon numbers, farm marks, and barge destinations. The final column contained initials, CV, Cecily Vale. A door opened above her. "Pike!" Miss Morrow descended from the upper office carrying a leather case. Lady Cecily says the Duke has taken the tenant's side. Everything bearing her name must leave tonight. Pike struck the ledger with his palm. The barge cannot carry all of it. Then burn what remains. Lydia looked toward the oil cans arranged along the eastern wall. The Larkfield fire had not been an impulsive act by frightened bailiffs. It was their established method of erasing evidence. Miss Morrow placed the leather case on the table and unlocked it. Inside lay Julian's missing seal press. Beside it were blank estate documents, sticks of black wax threaded with silver, and several sheets bearing Lydia's copied signature. The silver grains from the wedding contract had not been decorative. They marked documents created by Cecily's private clerk, allowing her conspirators to distinguish the forgeries from genuine estate papers. Lydia copied as much as she could, but footsteps approached behind the sacks. Thomas appeared at the end of the aisle. "We have to leave." The guard recognized me. Lydia tore a strip from the bottom of her borrowed coat, rubbed it against the fresh black wax inside the case, and pressed the fabric around the swallow clasp Pike had left beside the ledger. The wax caught the stamped shape. It was not decisive proof, but it connected the forged seal materials to the same clasps used on Ashbourne's altered deliveries. She slipped the fabric and copied pages into her bodice. A shout came from the gate. Thomas overturned an oil can to slow their pursuers, then seized Lydia's hand. They ran between the stacked grain, while guards closed in from both directions. "The river platform!" Lydia cried. They burst through the rear doors. The barge captain was already cutting his mooring rope. Thomas jumped aboard, but Lydia's borrowed skirt caught on a splintered post. Pike entered the doorway behind her. "There is nowhere left for you to run, Your Grace." He raised a pistol. A shot cracked through the warehouse. The weapon flew from Pike's hand. Julian stood on the riverbank with smoke curling from his own pistol. The tenant farmers surged through the gate behind him. Julian reached Lydia, tore the trapped cloth free, and pulled her away from the loading platform. Thomas and two farmers secured the barge captain while the others surrounded Pike's guards. Sir Matthew arrived minutes later with county officers. By then, Julian's men had opened the warehouse and uncovered the stolen grain. The magistrate stared at the rows of sacks. "This proves the goods were diverted, but not who ordered it." "The ledger does," Lydia said. They returned to the counting table. It was empty. During the confusion, Miss Morrow had escaped through the upper office with the ledger and leather case. All Lydia possessed were hurried copies in pencil, a wax-stained strip of cloth, and the swallow clasp. Pike immediately denied that the original ledger or seal press had ever existed. "Those notes could have been written by anyone," he said, "including the woman accused of creating false accounts." Sir Matthew's expression remained troubled. "Without the originals, they cannot be authenticated." Julian stepped close to Pike. "The grain can. North Vale Storage purchased it lawfully." "From whom?" "That information was contained in the ledger your wife claims to have seen." Pike's confidence revealed that Cecily had planned for this possibility. The warehouse connected him to stolen goods, but without the original accounts, he could argue that merchants or tenants had sold the grain privately. Sir Matthew ordered the warehouse sealed, and Pike detained for questioning. Yet Lydia knew he would not remain silent for long without Cecily's protection. While the officers counted the sacks, Julian led Lydia into the abandoned upper office. Her blistered hands trembled now that the danger had passed. He poured water from a pitcher and gently cleaned the soot from her palms. "You should have let me enter with you," he said. "Then Pike would have recognized you before I reached the ledger. He nearly killed you. He nearly killed Thomas as well." Julian wrapped a strip of linen around her right hand. "I accused you twice because trusting the wrong person once destroyed my family." Lydia waited. "My father learned that Cecily's husband had gambled away money belonging to the estate," he continued. "I defended her. I believed grief had made my father suspicious and cruel. He died before I discovered that he had been right." "That explains why you fear being deceived," Lydia said. "It does not excuse allowing that fear to make me bear the punishment." His hands stopped. "No," he said. "It does not." There was no dramatic plea in his voice, only painful recognition. "I cannot undo the chains placed on your wrists," he continued. But I can state publicly that I was wrong, restore your access to every estate record, and ensure no accusation is accepted again without your answer being heard. Begin with Thomas. His family remains vulnerable. They will receive a permanent lease in their own names. Lydia studied him. For the first time, he was offering repair without asking for forgiveness in exchange. Outside, the officers called for Julian. Before he left, he placed the sealed swallow clasp in Lydia's undamaged hand. You saw what no one else saw. Because no one else thought a flour sack worth examining. I did not mean the sack. Their eyes held for one suspended moment. Lydia felt the first fragile movement of something warmer than gratitude, but she refused to name it. Respect had only begun to grow between them, and trust remained a bridge built one decision at a time. Thomas entered after Julian left. Your Grace, you should see this. He held a torn corner of paper found beneath the counting table. It bore half of Cecily's initials and the imprint of Julian's seal. More importantly, one edge carried 3 small stitch holes. The paper had once been sewn into a ledger. It could be matched to the remaining fragment if they recovered the book. A horse galloped from the warehouse yard. Through the upper window, Lydia saw Miss Morrow racing toward Ashbourne with the leather case strapped behind her saddle. Then Thomas pointed toward the river. A second barge was drifting away from the far bank. Pike stood at its stern beside Sir Matthew's unconscious deputy. He had escaped custody. Pike looked up at the window and saw the paper in Lydia's hand. His expression changed. He now knew she possessed a fragment that could authenticate the stolen ledger, and Cecily would learn of it before Lydia could return to Ashbourne. "Stop that barge!" Julian shouted from the warehouse yard. The county officers ran toward the riverbank, but the current had already carried Pike beyond pistol range. 2 men launched a narrow boat after him, while Sir Matthew knelt beside his injured deputy. Lydia hurried downstairs with the torn paper secured inside her bodice. Thomas remained close, watching every doorway. "We must return to Ashbourne before Miss Morrow," Lydia said. Julian looked toward the northern road. "She has nearly a mile's advantage. Then she will reach Cecily first." They left the officers guarding the warehouse and rode in the empty grain wagon. The lighter horses moved faster without their stolen cargo, but storm clouds had gathered above the estate, and rain turned the road to mud. When Ashbourne House appeared between the trees, smoke was rising from its western wing. Lydia's stomach tightened. "The estate office," Julian said. They abandoned the wagon before it fully stopped. Servants formed a line across the courtyard, passing buckets toward the office windows. Flames had already consumed the curtains and climbed into the shelves. Mrs. Finch stood in the rain directing the staff. "Was anyone inside?" Julian demanded. "No, Your Grace. Miss Morrow reported smelling smoke shortly after she returned." "Where is she now?" "With Lady Cecily in the Great Hall." Lydia pushed through the office doorway, covering her mouth against the smoke. A burning beam crashed from the ceiling. Julian caught her around the waist and dragged her backward before it struck. "My father's box is in there," she cried. "If it is, you cannot save it." The roof collapsed, burying the records beneath fire and broken timber. The original leases, payment books, correspondence files, and whatever evidence Cecily had returned from the malt house were destroyed together. Lydia stood in the rain, watching years of Ashbourne's history turn to ash. Julian did not release her until she steadied herself. The Great Hall was crowded when they entered. Cecily had assembled the estate's remaining trustees, local landowners, tenants, servants, and Sir Matthew's clerk. At the center of the room stood Miss Morrow with the leather case. It was empty. "Julian," Cecily said, "thank heaven you are unharmed. We feared the fire at Larkfield had spread. You knew about the malt house. I know that you abandoned your estate to follow the accusations of a suspected thief. We found Ashbourne grain inside your company's warehouse. North Vale Storage is not my company. Your initials appeared throughout its ledger. A ledger no one else saw." Lydia removed her copied pages. "I recorded the entries." Cecily barely glanced at them. "Written in your own hand, using the same blue symbol found beside the fraudulent accounts. You have manufactured more evidence against yourself." Miss Morrow stepped forward. "I saw Her Grace copying figures at the warehouse. There was no ledger before her. Only blank paper. Thomas entered behind Lydia. That is a lie. Cecily turned upon him. The frightened servant she bribed with a permanent lease. A murmur passed through the gathered tenants. Sir Matthew arrived carrying a sealed packet saved from his carriage. There is another matter. Lady Cecily's solicitor has produced a codicil to the late Duke's will. He read it aloud. If Julian entered a marriage that exposed Ashbourne to criminal liability, and if he obstructed a lawful investigation into his spouse, temporary management would pass to the trustees until the accusation was resolved. Julian could prevent that transfer by surrendering Lydia to the county authorities and petitioning for immediate separation. Cecily's trap was complete. She had first arranged the accusation, then prepared the marriage, and finally used Julian's refusal to abandon Lydia as proof that he could no longer govern rationally. Sir Matthew faced him. If Her Grace submits to custody, you retain control of Ashbourne during the investigation. No, Julian said. Lydia looked at him. Think carefully. I am. You could lose the estate. I would deserve to lose it if keeping it required me to sacrifice an innocent woman for the second time. Cecily's smile returned. Then you leave us no choice. The trustees voted. 3 supported Cecily, 1 abstained. Julian alone opposed her. By sunset, Cecily Vale controlled Ashbourne. Her first order suspended the tenant protections in Lydia's marriage agreement. Her second dismissed Thomas and Mrs. Finch. Her third prohibited Julian and Lydia from entering the estate office, storerooms, farms, or servant quarters. The woman who had mocked Lydia for becoming a duchess now stood beneath the Harcourt crest and ordered her removed from the great hall. For the second time in 2 days, 2 constables escorted Lydia upstairs. This time, Julian walked beside her. They found her apartments ransacked. The cedar chest had been emptied, the wedding wardrobe slashed, and the slippers thrown into the fireplace. One had already burned. The other lay blackened near the grate. Lydia retrieved it with a poker. My father's box is gone, she said. The original ledgers are gone. The Malthouse ledger is gone. Our copies can be called inventions. Julian stood near the window, stripped of authority inside his own home. The warehouse remains full of Ashbourne grain. Cecily will claim North Vale bought it legally. The farmers' leases and delivery records burned in the office. I can testify that the seal on the amended collection order was false. She will claim grief impaired your memory. Silence filled the ruined room. Lydia turned the scorched slipper over. The embroidered initials had partly melted, leaving several silver threads twisted around the inner seam. She pulled gently. A narrow strip of stiff paper emerged from beneath the lining. It was not part of the shoe. It was a tailor's reinforcement cut from a discarded commercial invoice. Only a few words remained visible. Vale storage. 6 bridal gowns. Delivery 6 weeks before. Lydia's pulse quickened. The gowns had not been purchased privately by Cecily. They had been charged to North Vale Storage, the same company Cecily now claimed she did not own. Julian reached for the paper, but Lydia held it away from the candle. It is useful, but not enough. Cecily will say the name refers to someone else. Then what do we need? We need her to deny the connection publicly and in precise terms. Not merely that she does not own the company. She must swear she never ordered clothing through it, never authorized its payments, and never knew I would become your bride before my arrest. Julian understood. Then we produced the invoice. Not this fragment, the dressmaker's original account. The gowns came from London. We cannot reach the shop and return before Cecily begins evicting tenants. We do not have to. Lydia examined the stitch holes along the invoice fragment. 3 holes on one side, 2 on the other. The binding pattern used when merchants sewed duplicate bills into monthly account books. Her father had taught her that respectable London firms kept copies to pursue unpaid debts. The dressmaker would possess a duplicate bearing the customer's instructions and method of payment. Thomas appeared at the connecting door with Mrs. Finch. Both had used the old service passage to avoid Cecily's guards. Mrs. Finch held a leather dispatch book against her chest. I removed this before the office roof collapsed. Inside were records of every carriage and commercial package delivered to Ashbourne. 6 weeks earlier, a locked trunk had arrived from Madame Fournier's dressmaking establishment in London. The transport had been paid by North Vale Storage. The receiving signature belonged to Miss Morrow. There was also a later entry. A courier from Madame Fournier was expected at Ashbourne the following afternoon to collect the unpaid balance for 6 bridal gowns. Cecily did not know the courier was coming. Lydia looked toward the rain-darkened windows. Tomorrow, your aunt will convene the tenants in the Great Hall and declare their leases forfeit. What will you do? Julian asked. Let her speak first. Let her accuse me, deny North Vale, and explain why the marriage surprised her. And when the courier arrives, we will ask Cecily one final question she cannot answer without contradicting herself. Downstairs, a servant nailed Cecily's eviction notices to the doors. Lydia folded the scorched invoice fragment around the swallow clasp. The evidence appeared weak only because Cecily believed each piece stood alone. Lydia now saw the chain connecting them: the stolen grain, the delivery company, the prepared wardrobe, the forged seals, and the marriage arranged 6 weeks before the alleged crime forced Julian to propose. Cecily's greatest mistake had not been leaving a signature. It had been preparing Lydia's humiliation too early. Before dawn, Julian sent Thomas through the service passage with 3 instructions. He was to intercept Madame Fournier's courier before the man reached Ashbourne, bring him through the tenant village rather than the main gates, and ensure that the dressmaker's duplicate account never left his sight. Mrs. Finch hid the dispatch book inside the old chapel organ, where neither Cecily nor Pike possessed a key. Lydia wrapped the scorched invoice fragment and swallow clasp in linen, then sealed them inside an empty medicine bottle. Julian pressed his signet into wax across the stopper, while Mrs. Finch and Thomas witnessed it. Finally, Julian sent riders to the malt house with orders to guard the captured grain and record every farm mark before Cecily's trustees could remove it. By 10 o'clock, more than 100 Eastern tenants had been summoned to Ashbourne's Great Hall. Men entered with their caps in their hands. Women held leases and rent receipts against their chests. Many still smelled of smoke from Larkfield. Cecily sat beneath the Harcourt crest. Pike stood at her right hand. His reappearance produced an angry murmur. Sir Matthew rose from his chair. That man escaped lawful custody. Pike displayed a bruised wrist. I fled because the Duke's tenants intended to kill me. I returned voluntarily when Lady Cecily guaranteed my safety. You struck my deputy unconscious. The barge captain did that during the struggle. The captain had disappeared, leaving Pike free to construct whichever story served him. Cecily struck the floor once with the trustees' staff. We are gathered to determine the Eastern tenants' defaults and examine the fraud committed against Ashbourne. Lydia entered with Julian. Cecily's eyes narrowed. You were ordered to remain upstairs. You no longer possess the authority to confine me, Lydia said. Your codicil transferred management of the estate, not custody of its duchess. Sir Matthew nodded reluctantly. She is correct. Lydia and Julian stopped among the tenants rather than taking seats near the trustees. That choice changed the room. Cecily occupied the Duke's place, but Julian stood beside the people she intended to dispossess. Pike presented the charges first. He claimed the tenants had secretly sold their rent grain to North Vale Storage, then burned the Larkfield buildings to conceal the shortages. According to him, Lydia discovered the scheme while working in the kitchens and demanded a share. When Pike threatened to expose her, she stole the silver jug, manufactured evidence against him, and manipulated Julian into marriage. It was a dangerous lie, because every genuine event had been given a false cause. Cecily turned to Lydia. Do you deny using a blue crescent in your private accounts? No. Do you deny possessing knowledge of Ashbourne's deliveries before your marriage? No. Do you deny that Thomas Reed received a permanent lease after supporting your accusations? No. Cecily smiled toward the crowd. Then her grace confirms the essential facts. I confirm only that your story was constructed around facts you could not erase. Lydia stepped into the center of the hall. You claim the tenants sold their grain privately. Name one tenant who received payment. Pike gestured toward the assembled families. Their refusal to confess does not prove innocence. Then show us the purchase contracts. They were destroyed in the estate office. Show us the company's bank drafts. Contained in the malt house ledger stolen during the Duke's unlawful raid. You also claim I demanded a share. Where was my payment sent? Pike's mouth tightened. It may have been hidden. Like the silver hidden beneath my mattress after you entered my room? Thomas stepped forward. I saw him leave her room, and Miss Morrow followed carrying the silver. Miss Morrow rose from Cecily's side. He saw nothing. His family owes the Duchess its cottage. Mrs. Finch then produced Thomas's original wage records and the gatehouse tenancy ledger. Both proved that Julian had ordered the family's protection only after Thomas was attacked. Lydia faced Cecily. If I had bribed him before the theft charge, why was his father still dependent upon Mr. Pike's lease when I was arrested? The first doubt moved through the trustees. Lydia next ordered 3 recovered grain sacks brought inside. Each bore a different farm mark beneath black paint. Yet every cord was fastened with a swallow clasp. The grain came from separate farms, she said. Why was it retied with the same private mark after collection? Pike answered quickly. North Vale used those clasps at its warehouse. Then why did I find the same clasp on an unopened flour sack inside Ashbourne's storeroom before the grain reached North Vale? She displayed the medicine bottle. Sir Matthew inspected Julian's unbroken seal, while Mrs. Finch confirmed when the clasp had been secured. Pike shifted his argument. North Vale also supplied goods to Ashbourne. The shared clasp proves commerce, not theft. Precisely, Lydia said. Commerce you previously claimed was conducted only between North Vale and the tenants. Silence followed. Pike had overcommitted. If North Vale supplied Ashbourne directly, its managers had access to the estate's delivery quantities. If it traded only with tenants, the clasp should never have appeared inside Ashbourne's locked storeroom. Lydia then presented her calculations. The company had not taken random quantities from desperate farmers. Almost exactly 1/5 had been removed from flour, sugar, oil, wheat, and barley shipments over many months. Only someone with access to Ashbourne's internal accounts could maintain that proportion across unrelated goods. Cecily rose. Even if Pike committed fraud, you have not connected his actions to me. That is why I shall ask you directly. Do you own, control, finance, or receive benefit from North Vale Storage? I do not. Have you ever authorized a payment through that company? No. Did you order 6 gowns from Madame Fournier and arrange their delivery through North Vale? A slight pause. No. Did you know, 6 weeks before my arrest, that I would become Julian's bride? The question struck the room harder than an accusation. Cecily laughed. How could I? The Duke proposed only after the stolen silver was found. And the gowns in my exact size? I believed they belonged to Julian's mother. Her feet were 3 sizes smaller than mine. The surviving slipper carried my initials. Initials you could have added yourself. And the estate ledgers placed beneath my marriage contract. A servant arranged the chapel table. Which servant? I cannot be expected to remember every household instruction. Lydia allowed the silence to lengthen. Then you swear before Sir Matthew, the trustees, and every tenant present that you had no knowledge of my marriage before my arrest, placed no order with Madame Fournier, and had no financial connection to North Vale Storage. I swear it. The great doors opened. Thomas entered beside a gray-haired man wearing the sober black coat of a commercial clerk. 2 tenant farmers followed them, protecting a locked document case. Cecily's confidence faltered. The clerk bowed. Mr. Samuel Vane, chief accountant to Madame Fournier of Bond Street. I came to collect the unpaid balance for 6 bridal gowns commissioned by Lady Cecily Vale. I have never seen this man, Cecily said. Nor I you, my lady. Your orders were delivered in writing. Mr. Vane placed the case upon the central table, but kept one hand on it. Pike moved toward the side door. Julian blocked his path. Sir Matthew examined the lock. What does the case contain? Our duplicate order book, the original letter of commission, measurements supplied for the bride, and a payment draft issued by North Vale Storage. Miss Morrow suddenly cried, "The documents are forgeries." Mr. Vane looked at her. Then perhaps you can explain why your signature appears in our receiving book, and why you visited our shop twice for fittings conducted upon a servant's measurements." Every face turned toward Miss Morrow. She looked to Cecily for instruction. Cecily gave none. Mr. Vane unlocked the case and removed a thick account book bound with red cord. One page had been marked with a ribbon. Along its inner edge were 5 stitch holes matching the pattern on the scorched fragment Lydia had recovered from the slipper. The clerk reached for the ribbon. "Before I open this," he said, "the magistrate should know that Lady Cecily's written order included one instruction so unusual that Madame Fournier required 2 employees to witness it." Sir Matthew leaned forward. "What instruction?" Mr. Vane placed his hand upon the marked page. The gowns were to be completed for Lydia Bell's wedding to the Duke of Ashbourne, even though his Grace had not yet proposed to her. Mr. Vane opened the duplicate order book. The marked page listed Lydia's full measurements, the fabric selected for 6 gowns, the initials to be embroidered inside her slippers, and the date upon which every garment was to arrive at Ashbourne, 6 weeks before the wedding. Attached to the page was Cecily's original letter of commission. Her signature appeared at the bottom, and the black wax sealing it contained fine silver grains. Sir Matthew placed the letter beside the wax-stained cloth Lydia had taken from the malt house. The color, texture, and silver mixture were identical. Mr. Vane produced the payment draft next. The deposit was issued from North Vale Storage. The remaining balance was to be paid after Lady Cecily gained control of Ashbourne. Cecily's face went white. "That sentence has been added." "It has not," Lydia said. "The ink is the same age as the remaining entries, and the words continue beneath the commercial stamp. They could not have been inserted afterward without breaking its impression." Sir Matthew examined the page and nodded. Lydia placed the scorched fragment from the slipper beside the dressmaker's duplicate. The torn words aligned with the entry, while all 5 stitch holes matched the binding exactly. "The invoice hidden inside my slipper came from this account," Lydia said. "The gowns were paid for by North Vale because Lady Cecily controlled the company. She prepared me to become Julian's bride before the silver was planted in my room." Cecily gripped the trustee's staff. "A wardrobe proves nothing about stolen grain." "No, your own system proves that." Lydia ordered the recovered sacks arranged before the trustees according to their farm marks. She then displayed her copied figures from the malt house. Mr. Pike removed approximately 1/5 from every delivery entering Ashbourne. The same proportion appears in North Vale's records. He then collected the tenants' rent grain 1 day early, intending to empty their barns and declare them in default. "Those are still your figures," Pike protested. "The warehouse officers counted every sack after we left." Sir Matthew received their sealed report this morning. The magistrate opened the packet delivered by his deputy. The official totals matched Lydia's calculations almost exactly. Pike's confidence finally broke. Lydia continued. "North Vale could not have taken the same proportion from flour, sugar, oil, wheat, and barley without access to Ashbourne's internal invoices. The swallow clasps prove the goods were opened and retied after reaching the estate. One clasp was preserved beneath Julian's unbroken seal before the malt house was discovered." She faced Cecily. "You stole twice. First, you removed part of every delivery and sold it through North Vale. Then you intended to seize the eastern farms by stealing the tenants' rent grain and calling them defaulters." Sir Matthew turned to Pike. "And when Larkfield resisted?" Pike looked toward Cecily. She answered for him. "The tenants started the fire." Lydia shook her head. "The oil used at Larkfield came from Ashbourne's own reduced delivery. 1 can was found beside the rear wall, retied with the same swallow clasp. Your men removed the grain first, set the fire second, and expected the missing stores and leases to disappear together." Thomas stepped forward. Mrs. Reed and her children were still inside. "That was Pike's doing," Cecily said quickly. "I never ordered anyone harmed." Pike stared at her. "You ordered every remaining record burned. Be silent. You said the families would flee once the smoke began." Sir Matthew signaled the constables. Pike backed away. "She promised me the eastern farms. Lord Haversham would purchase them after the evictions, and North Vale would retain the river rights. I only followed the plan she designed." Cecily struck him across the face with the trustee's staff. The constables seized both of them. Miss Morrow began to cry. When Sir Matthew questioned her, She admitted taking Mrs. Finch's spare keys, placing the silver jug beneath Lydia's mattress, and delivering the forged receipts. In exchange for testifying and surrendering the remaining North Vale correspondence hidden in her room, she would later receive a reduced charge. The complete design was finally visible. Cecily had known Julian would marry before his 30th birthday, rather than surrender Ashbourne to the trustees. She therefore prepared two paths to the same victory. If he failed to marry, she gained control under the original will. If he married Lydia, the servant Cecily had framed and placed directly beneath his protection, the criminal liability codicil would remove him anyway. Lydia had been chosen because she already suspected the delivery fraud. By copying her blue crescent from the stolen account box, Cecily could turn Lydia's knowledge into evidence of guilt. The marriage contract was then arranged above the hidden ledgers, so witnesses would remember Lydia's signature beside the false accounts. "She was never an accidental bride," Julian said. "She was the center of your trap." Cecily lifted her chin even while the constables bound her wrists. "Look at her. Did you truly believe society would accept that woman as a duchess?" The great hall became silent. Julian stepped beneath the Harcourt crest, but he did not answer from the trustee's chair. Instead, he moved to stand beside Lydia among the tenants. "Society accepted my title before I had earned its respect," he said. "Lydia earned respect long before she possessed a title." He then faced the entire room. "I allowed fear to outweigh evidence. I questioned my wife after she had already been falsely arrested, restricted her movements, and surrendered records she had warned me to protect. Those failures belong to me. Her courage does not erase them." His public acknowledgement carried no request for immediate forgiveness. He ordered every eviction notice removed. The Eastern leases were renewed for 21 years, with the first year's rent forgiven to compensate for the stolen grain and fire damage. North Vale's warehouse, barges, and remaining funds were seized pending judgment and used to rebuild Larkfield. Pike was charged with fraud, arson, assault, attempted murder, and escape from lawful custody. Cecily faced conspiracy, forgery, theft, arson, and abuse of trusteeship. Her interest in the estate was suspended, and her personal property was placed under court supervision to repay the families she had harmed. Weeks later, Lydia entered the same chapel where guests had once laughed at her. This time, the tenants filled the pews. Julian waited beside the register, but there was no marriage contract upon the table. Instead, he had prepared a deed, granting Lydia separate property, independent income, and equal authority over Ashbourne's household and charitable accounts, whether she remained his wife or chose to leave. "You owe me none of this," she said. "I owe you the freedom I should have protected from the beginning. And if I refuse to remain, the deed remains yours." Lydia signed. Lydia signed. Then she looked at the man who had first offered her a marriage without affection, and later risked his estate rather than surrender her. He had not become gentle overnight, nor had she forgotten the chains on her wrists, but he had begun repairing what fear and pride had damaged. "I will remain," she said, "for 1 year." Hope entered his gray eyes. "And after that, you may ask me again." He offered his arm, but did not presume she would take it. Lydia made him wait for 3 heartbeats before placing her hand upon his sleeve. When they turned toward the aisle, no one laughed. The woman who had once walked alone beneath the weight of their contempt now chose her own pace, her own future, and the man permitted to walk beside her.